Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. And what a weird one. Where the hell am I? This isn't my normal set. Well, in actual fact, I am in the middle of Speyside in the very, very nice Station Hotel in Rothes. I'm being put up by Glenlivet. It's their 200th year anniversary. And last night I went to their fantastic 200th year anniversary party, I guess, or 200th year birthday party, where they revealed a fantastic 55-year-old whiskey. Now, I thought I'd try a different take on video on this channel. I'm always going to these sorts of events, so what do you think of this sort of format where I bring you along a little bit? Now, I'll do another video about the 55-year-old at another point. None of this is sponsored, by the way. I'm just making it because I think it's cool. And for this video, like the Glenlivet distillery, it's not one really that we've talked about much on this channel, but it's so interlinked with the history of so many of the massive names that we all know in whiskey, and Glenlivet is kind of like the OG of whiskey in many ways. And one of the key things that you need to know about Glenlivet is that we wouldn't really have a lot of the Speyside whiskies that we know today if it wasn't for Glenlivet, and if it wasn't really specifically for someone called the Duke of Gordon. Now, the Duke of Gordon was a massive landowner up in Speyside, and he happened to have a tenant called George Smith. George Smith was a gentleman farmer up in the hills in Speyside in Glenlivet. Glenlivet is a place, by the way. It's a bit like saying London or something like that. It's the valley of the Livet River. And so the Duke of Gordon was a landowner, and his tenant was George Smith, and George Smith was a bit of a cheeky one. He was illicitly distilling, illicitly as in illegally distilling, and the Duke of Gordon kind of realised, probably having conversations with his tenant George Smith, that you could probably make a lot more money if this became legal. So George Smith, working with the Duke of Gordon, well, the Duke of Gordon more using his sort of political weight, was the one that really pushed through the 1823 Excise Act. And that's, of course, why 1824 to 2024 is the Glenlivet's 200th year anniversary. Same with Macallan, their 200th year anniversary. It's no coincidence. It comes about because of the taxation. So you have this really interesting tax system prior to this 1823 introduction, or this 1823 license to distill. And prior to 1823, there was a split between the lowlands of Scotland and the highlands of Scotland, and depending on where you were would depend on how you were taxed. So in the southern part of Scotland, as in the lowlands, you would just be taxed on the amount of whiskey you made, because it was quite easy for the tax inspectors to come and check on how much you made. But as soon as you crossed over this invisible line into Scotland, so into the Highlands, then you'd be taxed according to the size of your still. So no matter whether you were running that still permanently 24/7, day in, day and night, you would be taxed the same as if you use that still for 1 hour, because you were taxed on the size of the still, not on the amount of your production. And that's really what the change that was brought about by the 1823 Excise Act. So you had to get a license for distillation, and this was the 1823 Excise Act. So why did everybody come in 1824? Well, in 1823, the license was 50 guineas, and in 1824, that dropped to like 5 or 10 guineas, something like that. So it dropped massively. So that's why you see so many distilleries going legal in that sort of like 1824 onwards period, but not too many in 1823. Now, of course, if you're going to bring in a license to distill, and let's remember, like, why are there so many distilleries in Speyside? It's kind of like Scotland's industrial estate, for if you can call it that. It's a very beautiful industrial estate, mind you, but it's just packed full of distilleries, 50, 60 or so, somewhere in that region. But why are they all up here? Simple, because it was so hard for people to come and check your taxes, so it was so much easier for illicit whiskey production. And actually, as part of this tour with Glenlivet that I did today, we went up to the original farm site, and I'll stick some footage on screen now of the original farm site where the original licensed and unlicensed Glenlivet distillery was. Like, come on, take a look at it. How easy is it for a tax inspector to get up there? You've got the cairngorms blocking the way, and of course, whiskey was then a seasonal production. You wouldn't just make whiskey all year round. No, you would make whiskey with the harvest. So as the harvest came in the autumn and you had all your barley, well, hang on a minute, the water's just got incredibly cold and there's a lot more of that water, which increases the ability or aids your distillation process. So whiskey was always historically like a seasonal produce, and it was a way of just sort of like using the barley to a certain extent, and then you'd use the products that you created with the whiskey to exchange for money and therefore pay your rent and all sorts of stuff like that. But the reason why there's so many up in Speyside specifically, yes, historically it was very easy to evade taxes up there because of the geography, but also you had those vital ingredients. You have lots of rivers. You've got like the River Spey, obviously, so like where the Macallan is, obviously, and then on the banks of these rivers, you've got these incredible fertile fields for growing the other material you need, which is barley. So, but you've got to go back to the 1820s. Okay, right, it's now legal to distill, but hang on a minute, I still want to distill illegally. So how do they try and stop everybody distilling illegally, and what was the incentive there? Well, one of the key things that they did was bring in a £5 reward, which was a lot of money back in those days, to incentivize you to snitch on your neighbor who had an illicit still. So of course, this is like so distrust and so like fear amongst those that were distilling illegitimately. But of course, there's stories, and I don't know how true these stories are, but of course what you would do is you would run your still for however long you needed to run it for, however many years or whatever it was, and then as the copper became thin and worn out, that's when you would get your friend to just like tell the tax inspector, oh, there's an illicit stiller hidden over there. Of course, the excise man comes and finds a still, an illicit one, but a very worn out one. And then they got £5. What could they do with that £5? Go and buy themselves a new still. And again, like this isn't just like this worked. Like, there's at the Glenlivet distillery, you've got the pistols that belonged to George Smith, because he was so feared for his life that he was kind of one of the key instigators in bringing in this new taxing system, that he kind of got a bit scared for himself. So he was gifted these. I've got some notes here. He was gifted them by the Laird of Aberlour. And you know, how fantastic is that 200 years later, we've still got these pistols that he was using to defend himself against taxes. And of course, today there's a bit of a, like, whiskey's getting expensive, people, isn't it? Like I just don't get. That's one for another story. But like this £5 system really worked because it sowed fear, it sowed distrust, so much so that George Smith was walking around with these pistols. And how cool was that last night to be able to see these? And they are actually on permanent display in the Glenlivet distillery. And if you ever go there, it's cool. Again, this isn't sponsored, it's whatever. Just like, look, I go to a lot of distilleries. It's a cool one, and it's a very smart one to go to as well. Now, the other thing that you've got to remember about Glenlivet and the success of the Glenlivet, and this is kind of linking back to everything else that we talk about on this channel, which is quite often Macallan, is that Glenlivet became a byword for quality Scotch. So Glenlivet, as I've mentioned, is a region, it's a place. You can't call yourself, or you can't you can't trademark a geographic location. That's how we have the independent bottling laws today. So what did they do to do this? Because of course, like, look at whiskey bottles nowadays, like, well, not nowadays, but if you look at them recent bottlings from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even early 90s, Macallan Glenlivet, Aberlour Glenlivet, you know, there was dozens of whiskies that were not necessarily in the Glen of Livet. It's arguably the longest glen in Scotland by how many distilleries are in there. But a lot of brands, even Macallan up until like the 1980s, were using the Glenlivet suffix. And again, that suffix, the way that it's Macallan Glenlivet and not Glenlivet Macallan, all came down to trademark cases, I think you would probably call them, in the 19th century, when they were trying to protect their name. And if you think that Macallan was still using the Glenlivet suffix in the 1980s, imagine how many of those distilleries were wanting to use them in the 1880s, 100 years before that. So what happened was that George Smith petitioned, and again, last night there was this cool indenture, and we'll put this on screen for you now. This is the indenture that gave the Glenlivet distillery the right to use the word the Glenlivet, and nobody else could. So everybody else could call themselves Macallan Glenlivet or Aberlour Aberlour Glenlivet, but Glenlivet were the only ones that could be called the Glenlivet. And I just think that's so cool. And like this video, a bit of a random one, isn't it? But it's just a bit of but there's just so many cool things that interplay with these brands that we know and love today. But tell me people, what do you think of this style of video? Do you want to see more of these slightly informal, slightly random location videos? Or do you want me to get back in the studio and do more formal, like deep dives and stuff? Anyway, tell me in the comments, let me know what you think. And as always, new videos every week. Thank you very much.